September 24th, 1944, the Netherlands. The smell of fresh bread still hung in the air when the German tanks rolled back in. Anna Decker grabbed her two children and ran for the church cellar as shells tore through her village. They were told liberation meant safety, that the Americans had won, that the war was moving east, away from them. But now they were trapped underground, and above them, German armor crushed everything they dared to hope for. Then an American paratrooper appeared through the smoke. Jake Morrison didn't retreat with his unit. Instead, he crawled back into the crossfire, scooped up her paralyzed son, and shoved them all into that cellar moments before the building exploded. Later, as friendly fire rained down on their refugee camp, these soldiers broke every order to search for one lost Dutch boy in no man's land. They weren't following protocol. They were following something else entirely. These Americans risked everything for people they'd just met, and it shattered everything the war said about enemies and strangers. But before we begin, if you want to hear more incredible, untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. The smell of fresh bread filled Anna Decker's kitchen on that September morning, the kind of smell that meant safety, that meant tomorrow would come. Her hands worked the dough with the practiced rhythm of a woman who had baked through bombings and blackouts and the long years when there was no flour at all. But today there was flour. Today the sun came through the windows warm and golden, and outside her small house in Vagel, American paratroopers walked the streets like guardian angels who had dropped from the sky 3 weeks ago and promised the war was finally moving away. Anna shaped the dough into rounds and set them on the wooden board her grandmother had used. Her grandmother's grandmother before that. Some things survived. Some things had to survive. In the next room, Peter sat at the table practicing his letters, his tongue poking out in concentration the way his father's used to. 8 years old, and already he was forgetting Jan's voice, and Anna couldn't decide if that was mercy or tragedy. Little Sophie played on the floor with a cloth doll that had seen better days, talking to it in that serious way 4-year-olds have, explaining the rules of a world she was too young to understand had broken. The church bells rang across the village, marking the hour. Anna paused, her hand still in the dough, and let herself feel it. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. The Americans had liberated them. The Germans were retreating east. Every day now there were fewer soldiers, fewer tanks, fewer reasons to be afraid. The local women whispered that the war would be over by Christmas. Anna didn't let herself believe that far ahead, but she let herself believe in this moment, in this bread, in the fact that her children were alive and safe under her roof. The knock at the door came mid-morning. Anna wiped her hands on her apron and found Corporal Jake Morrison on her doorstep. Tall and young and impossibly American, with that easy smile that seemed to come from a country that had never been occupied. He had been billeted with the family down the street, and he stopped by her bakery most mornings now, trading chocolate for bread in careful broken Dutch that made Sophie giggle behind her hands. Today he had a Hershey bar and an apology. His unit was moving out tomorrow. The war was heading east, he said, and they were going with it. Anna thanked him for the chocolate and traded it for 2 loaves, still warm. She watched him crouch down to Sophie's level, showing her how to say thank you in English, his hands gentle and patient. Peter appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the American voice he had started to imitate, and Jake ruffled his hair the way fathers do. For just a moment, standing in her doorway with the sun warm on her face and an American soldier making her children laugh, Anna let herself imagine a future. Maybe Jan would come home. Maybe the camps would open and he would walk back through that door and they would rebuild what had been broken. Maybe this terrible thing was finally, actually ending. The sound started as distant thunder. Anna looked up at the clear blue sky, confused. Jake's smile disappeared. He stood slowly, his whole body changing, becoming something else, something she recognized from the early days of occupation. A soldier hearing what civilians couldn't yet name. Then the first shell hit the eastern edge of town, and Anna's kitchen window shattered inward in a spray of glass and light. Peter screamed. Sophie started crying. Jake was already moving, shouting something in English that Anna's panic couldn't translate. More explosions, closer now, the kind that shook the ground and knocked pictures off walls. Through the broken window, she could see smoke rising, people running, and then the shape of something massive moving between the houses. German tanks, rolling back into Vega like they had never left, like liberation was just a story someone had made up to be cruel. The Americans in the street were scrambling, grabbing weapons, shouting orders that got lost in the chaos. A truck exploded at the corner, the sound so loud it wiped out everything else for a moment. When Anna's hearing came back, it was full of screaming. Jake grabbed her arm, his face urgent, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear over the noise. She understood anyway. "Run!" She scooped up Sophie and reached for Peter, but the boy was frozen by the window, staring at the burning truck with eyes that were too wide, too empty. Anna shouted his name, but he didn't move. The world was fire and smoke and the mechanical roar of tanks crushing everything in their path. Then Jake was there, lifting Peter like he weighed nothing, pushing them all toward the door. They ran into the street, and it was chaos, pure chaos. Civilians and soldiers tangled together in panic. The church. Everyone was running for the church. Anna followed the crowd, her lungs burning, Sophie heavy in her arms, Jake right behind her with Peter. The church cellar, the old shelter from the First War, the one that had protected their grandparents. They stumbled down the stone steps into the darkness as the world above them tore itself apart. Other people crowded in behind them. Meneer Van Dyke from the butcher shop holding his chest, the widow Jansen with her sister, children crying, someone praying. Jake set Peter down and turned back toward the entrance just as the building above them took a direct hit. The world ended in thunder and falling stone. When the dust settled, the darkness was absolute. Anna's ears rang with a high, thin sound that wouldn't stop, and she couldn't tell if Sophie was still crying or if the crying was just an echo inside her head. She felt for her daughter in the black, found her warm and solid and breathing, and pulled her close. Somewhere in the darkness, Peter was calling for her, his voice small and scared, and she reached out until she found his hand and held it tight enough to hurt. The cellar had become a tomb. Where the entrance had been, there was now only rubble, tons of it blocking out every trace of light. Anna could hear breathing around her, whispers, someone praying in Dutch that sounded like drowning. Her mind tried to count the people who had made it down the steps. 7, maybe 8 civilians. And Jake. She could hear him moving in the dark, his boots scraping against stone, assessing what couldn't be seen. Dust filled the air so thick it coated her tongue when she tried to speak. Anna pulled her apron up over Sophie's face to help her breathe, then over her own. The little girl had gone quiet in that terrible way children do when fear moves past crying into something deeper. Peter pressed against Anna's side, and she could feel him shaking. Above them, the rumble of heavy machinery. German tanks rolling through the village they had just lost for the second time. Jake's voice came from near the collapsed entrance, low and steady, trying to project calm in a language most of them barely understood. He was digging, she realized, moving rubble piece by piece in the darkness, trying to find a way out. But he was doing it quietly, carefully, because the enemy was right above their heads and any sound too loud might bring them down to investigate. Hours passed in the dark. Anna had no way to measure time except by Sophie's breathing, by the ache in her arms from holding her daughter, by the way her mouth grew drier and drier until swallowing hurt. Someone near the back of the cellar was crying softly. Meneer Van Dyke, the butcher, was making a wet, rattling sound with each breath that Anna recognized from the occupation. Years. A chest wound. She had seen enough of them to know. Jake appeared beside her in the dark, pressing his canteen into her hands. She tried to give it back, but he wouldn't take it. She gave Sophie a small sip, then Peter, then made her way through the darkness to where Meneer Van Dyke sat slumped against the wall. The old man took water with shaking hands. Anna tore strips from her apron, the same apron she had used to carry flour that morning in another lifetime, and tried to pack the wound as best she could without being able to see it. The children were hungry. Everyone was hungry. Anna had nothing to give them. She had run from her kitchen with her hands still covered in dough, and now that seemed like the cruelest joke. To have had bread, to have had flour and safety and hope, and to lose it all in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then the boots came, heavy and deliberate across the rubble above. Everyone in the cellar froze. Even Sophie went still as death, her small body rigid with instinctive fear. German voices filtered down through the cracks, sharp and commanding. Jake moved toward the entrance, and Anna knew without seeing that he had his weapon ready, that he would fight if they were discovered, that they would all die in this hole in the ground. The voices stopped directly above them. Someone was standing on the rubble. Anna held her breath and felt Peter do the same beside her. One of the soldiers above was younger than the others, his voice different, less certain. He said something in German that made the other soldiers laugh, something about ghosts and cellars. Then their boots moved on, crunching away through the ruins, but the young voice didn't follow. Anna heard him moving stones above, slow and careful. Then words, hesitant, in broken English. "Are children down there?" It wasn't quite a question, more like a hope spoken into the darkness. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. This could be a trap. This could be the moment they all died. Jake was utterly still beside her, and she knew he was weighing the same calculation. The young German soldier spoke again, quieter now. "I hear breathing. I hear small breathing. Please. Our children." Anna felt Peter start to respond and clamped her hand gently over his mouth. No one moved. No one breathed. The soldier above them made a sound that might have been frustration or grief, and then something dropped through a crack in the rubble. It hit the floor with a soft thud, then another. A canteen, bread, black German bread wrapped in paper. The young voice came again, urgent now. "I make whole. You come out. Quiet. Others come back soon. You must be quiet." Jake moved toward the sound, and Anna heard him checking the entrance, testing whether this was real or madness. Then stones started moving above, methodically, carefully, and a sliver of gray light cut through the darkness. The young German soldier was widening the gap, moving rubble, and Anna could see now that he was barely more than a boy, 19 at most, with scared eyes and shaking hands. Jake looked back at her through the dimness. His face asked the question his mouth couldn't risk. Should we trust him? Anna looked at Sophie, whose lips were cracked from thirst, at Peter, who had stopped shaking and started that terrible stillness that meant a child was giving up. She looked at Mynheer van Dijk, whose breathing was getting worse. Then she looked at the young German soldier who was risking his life for strangers. Anna nodded. One by one, they crawled through the gap the German boy had made, emerging into a world transformed into hell. Smoke hung so thick Anna could barely see 10 feet ahead. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now just broken teeth against the sky. The young soldier, who whispered his name was Willie, guided them through the ruins with frantic urgency, always listening, always watching for his unit to return. He led them along shattered walls and through gardens turned to ash, taking paths that kept them hidden from the main roads where German armor still rolled. Sophie whimpered once and Willie froze, his whole body tense, until the sound of nearby voices faded. Then he moved again, quicker now. Anna carried Sophie and Jake carried Mynheer van Dijk, the old man's weight growing heavier with each step, his breathing more labored. At the edge of town where Dutch countryside met devastation, Willie stopped. Through the smoke, Anna could see American helmets, foxholes, the organized chaos of a defensive line being hastily reformed. The paratroopers were digging in, preparing for the next assault. Willie pointed toward them, then stepped back into the shadows. He couldn't go further. To cross that line meant capture or death. Jake grabbed his arm, and for a moment the two young men stood facing each other. Enemy soldiers who had just saved each other's lives in the space between orders and conscience. Willie pulled something from his pocket, a photograph worn soft at the edges, and pressed it into Anna's hand. She looked down at the image of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with blonde braids and a gap-toothed smile. "My sister," Willie said in his broken English. "Keep them safe. Keep all children safe." Then he was gone, melting back into the smoke and rubble like a ghost who had never been there at all. Anna stood holding the photograph of a German child while her own children clung to her skirt and understood with sudden clarity that grief looked the same in every language. Jake was already moving toward the American lines, calling out passwords, identifying himself. Soldiers appeared from foxholes, weapons raised and then lowered when they recognized one of their own. They helped carry Meneer Van Dyke the last 100 yards to where medics had set up a field station in a half-collapsed barn. Anna watched them lay the old butcher on a stretcher, watched a medic named Ramirez start working on him with quick, competent hands. But she could see in Ramirez's face what he wasn't saying. They were too late. The wound had bled too long in the darkness. Meneer Van Dyke's breathing was barely there now, each breath a fight he was losing. Anna knelt beside him and took his hand, and the old man opened his eyes one last time. He had sold her family meat for 10 years. He had slipped them extra during the occupation when the Germans weren't watching. He had been kind. He died while she held his hand, and Peter saw it all. Her son stood 3 feet away and watched life leave a body, watched the exact moment when a person became a thing, and something in his face changed that Anna knew she would never be able to change back. She wanted to shield him from it, but it was too late. The war had already taken his innocence. All she could do now was teach him that witnessing death didn't mean abandoning compassion. Captain Davies found them an hour later. He was older than Jake, gruff and tired, with the kind of authority that came from keeping men alive through impossible situations. He listened to Jake's report about the cellar and the German soldier, his face unreadable. Then he looked at Anna and her children, at the other civilians huddled in the barn, and made a decision that probably violated 6 different regulations. They would pull back at dawn, he told Jake, fall back to a more defensible position, and they would take the civilians with them. It would slow them down. It would complicate the withdrawal. But they would do it anyway because leaving people to die when you could save them wasn't something Davies would ask his men to live with. That night, the paratroopers shared what little they had. Rations split a dozen ways. Canteens passed hand to hand. A private named Miller grumbled about the weight of extra civilians during a combat withdrawal, but Anna noticed he gave his chocolate bar to Sophie when he thought no one was watching. Doc Ramirez played harmonica, something slow and sad that sounded like home wherever home was, and the children gathered around him like moths to light. Peter sat with the soldiers, absorbing everything, and they taught him to say Geronimo the way they shouted it when they jumped from planes. They showed him their unit patches and told him sanitized stories about parachuting from the sky. For a little while, he was just a boy again, wide-eyed and eager, not the child who had watched a man die that afternoon. Sophie fell asleep in Jake's lap while he told Anna about Tennessee, about a farm that seemed impossibly far away, about red clay and tobacco fields and a creek that ran year-round. She told him about Jan, about the man who taught literature to farm children and hid a Jewish family in their cellar and paid for that kindness with his freedom. They didn't call what was growing between them by any name. There was no time for names. But they understood each other in the way people do when they've survived something together that should have killed them. Jake asked if she thought they would win. Not the battle, not even the war, but the thing beneath it. The fight to stay human when everything pushed you toward becoming something else. Anna looked at her children sleeping, at the soldiers sharing their last cigarettes, at the photograph of Willie's sister still clutched in her hand. "We're trying," she said. "That has to count for something." The shells came just before dawn, when the sky was that pale gray color that promises morning but hasn't delivered it yet. Anna woke to the whistle and knew what it meant half a second before the first one hit. Not German shells this time, American ones. Friendly fire, that terrible phrase that made killing your own people sound like an accident of affection. The barn exploded in chaos and flame. Anna threw herself over Sophie, felt Jake throw himself over both of them, felt the heat and concussion of the blast roll over them like a physical thing. Wood splintered. Canvas tore. Someone was screaming. When Anna could see again through the smoke and dust, half the barn was simply gone, erased by shells that were meant to hit German positions but had struck the wrong coordinates instead. Doc Ramirez was dead. The medic who had played harmonica and made children laugh was just gone, his body torn apart by shrapnel from his own side's artillery. Anna saw him and looked away fast, trying to shield Peter's eyes, but her son had already seen. They had all seen. The soldiers were shouting, trying to organize, trying to evacuate what was left of the barn before the next barrage came. But Peter was gone. Anna realized it with a lurch of pure terror that wiped out everything else. Her son had been sleeping 3 feet away, and now there was just empty space and smoke. She screamed his name and got no answer. The barn was collapsing, fire spreading through the dry wood, and her boy was somewhere in this hell and she couldn't find him. Jake grabbed her arm, but she tore free, calling for Peter, moving through the smoke and flames like a woman possessed. Other soldiers tried to stop her, but she fought past them with strength she didn't know she had. Her child was out there. Nothing else mattered. Jake was beside her then, and 2 other paratroopers whose names she didn't know, all of them moving back toward the village they had barely escaped, moving toward the German lines, moving toward death if that's where Peter had run. Captain Davies was shouting orders to fall back, to consolidate the line, but Jake wasn't listening. He was following Anna into no man's land with his rifle up and his eyes scanning the ruins. The other 2 soldiers came with him because you didn't leave your brothers, and Anna had become something like family in the way combat makes family out of strangers. The village was a nightmare in daylight, bodies in the streets, some in uniform and some not. The smell of smoke and cordite and things Anna's mind refused to name. Somewhere in the distance, a child was crying. Anna ran toward the sound and Jake ran with her, both of them exposed and vulnerable and beyond caring. They found him in the church, the same church that had almost been their tomb. Peter was huddled behind the altar with 3 other children, all of them orphaned by the shelling, all of them crying and too terrified to move. And standing guard over them, wounded and swaying but still upright, was Willie. The young German soldier had a piece of shrapnel in his side and blood soaking his uniform. But when he heard the American artillery hitting the barn, he had come back. He had run toward the explosions instead of away because there were children and someone had to protect them. Now he stood there with his hands empty and his face gray from blood loss, looking at Jake with eyes that expected death and accepted it. Jake raised his rifle. Anna saw his finger on the trigger, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Willie was enemy. Willie was Wehrmacht. Taking him back meant making him a prisoner, meant interrogation, meant consequences Anna couldn't predict. But leaving him meant watching him bleed out, meant letting the person who had saved them die alone in a ruined church. Peter broke free and ran to Willie, wrapping his arms around the German boy's legs, and Willie swayed but didn't fall. The child who had frozen in the street 3 days ago, who had needed to be carried to safety, now stood between a German soldier and an American rifle and refused to move. Anna stepped forward and put herself between Jake and Willie, between the war and mercy, between what orders said and what conscience demanded. She met Jake's eyes and saw the fight happening there, saw him wrestling with training and duty, and the simple human fact that the enemy bleeding in front of him had twice chosen kindness over survival. "You told me you were here to save us," Anna said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. She had buried her husband's memory, watched a man die in her arms, lost and found her son in the space of an hour. She had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Prove it," she said. Jake lowered his rifle. He looked at Willie, at the blood spreading across his uniform, at the children clustered around him like he was shelter instead of enemy. Then he slung his weapon and moved forward, catching Willie as the boy's legs finally gave out. They carried them all back, Peter and the orphans and the wounded German soldier who had saved them. Captain Davies saw them coming across the broken ground, saw the enemy uniform, saw Anna's face. He was quiet for a long moment, and Anna understood he was making a choice that could end his career or worse. "Get the medic," Davies said finally, "and someone find this man some American clothes before anyone else sees that uniform." Over the next 3 days, something shifted in the ruins of Wegel that nobody could have predicted, and the history books would never record. The 101st held their line. Reinforcements arrived, supply trucks rolled in with real food, medical supplies, tents that didn't leak. The German counterattack stalled and then broke, pushed back by men who had learned that retreat wasn't the same as defeat and that sometimes holding ground meant holding on to the people on it. The Americans set up a proper aid station in what had been a schoolhouse. Willie recovered there, treated by the same medics who patched up American wounded, his German uniform buried in a ditch and replaced with spare fatigues that almost fit. Nobody asked questions they didn't want answered. The official paperwork listed him as a Dutch civilian, displaced by the fighting, and Captain Davies signed it without blinking, his signature authorizing a mercy that regulations never contemplated. Willie could speak 3 languages, it turned out. German and English and enough Dutch to get by. He became the bridge between the Americans trying to help and the civilians trying to survive, translating requests for food and medicine, explaining that the water from the east well was safe but the south one wasn't, helping organize the chaos into something manageable. Peter followed him everywhere. This boy who had lost his father and found something like an older brother in the least likely place imaginable. The children drew pictures. Sophie drew constantly, her small hands covered in charcoal, creating images of houses with roofs still attached and tables with food and families that were whole. She drew Jake with his parachute opening above him like angel wings. She drew Willie holding flowers, though Anna had no idea where that image came from except maybe from the place in children's hearts that insists on seeing goodness even when the world offers none. One evening, sitting around a fire that burned in an oil drum, Private Miller broke the silence that had settled over them. He had been the one to complain about civilians slowing them down, the one whose cynicism leaked into every conversation like poison into water. But now he spoke quietly, staring into the flames, and his voice carried a different kind of pain. "They told us this would be over by Christmas," he said, "that we'd liberate Europe and the people would be free and it would all mean something. But look at this. Look at what we did to them. Our own shells killed more civilians than we saved." Jake looked at Anna across the fire. She was mending someone's jacket with thread she'd pulled from a ruined curtain. Her hands never still, always fixing something because fixing meant there was still hope. He thought about Tennessee, about the farm waiting for him if he lived through this, about the letter in his pocket he hadn't had time to write. "But we're here," Jake said finally, "and that has to count for something." Willie shifted beside the fire, his wound still tender but healing. He had been quiet since they brought him back, speaking only when spoken to, moving carefully like someone who understood how fragile his safety was. But now he looked up, and in the firelight his young face showed all the years the war had stolen. "I was told you were monsters," Willie said. His English was getting better every day, the words coming easier. That Americans would kill everyone, burn everything, that you had no mercy, but you shared your food with your enemies. You saved children who were not yours. Maybe this is the real victory, not the battles. This. Anna thought about Jan then, about her husband who had hidden a Jewish family and paid for it with everything. She had begged him not to do it, had been so afraid, and that fear had turned to guilt she carried like stones in her pockets. But watching these soldiers and this German boy and her own children learning that kindness could exist even in war, she understood something Jan had tried to tell her before they took him away. That choosing mercy when the world demanded cruelty wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made you human. A week after the friendly fire, word came through the Dutch underground. Anna heard it from a resistance fighter who appeared at the aid station asking for medical supplies and stayed long enough to share news. Jan was alive. In a camp, yes. Suffering, certainly. But alive. He had survived 2 years and he was still surviving, and if the Allies kept pushing east, if the camps were liberated, she would see him again. Anna wept. Not the quiet tears she had cried in the dark when the children were sleeping, but great shaking sobs that came from a place so deep she hadn't known it existed. She wept for relief and grief tangled together, for the husband stolen and the hope returned, for everything lost and the small chance of everything found again. Jake held her while she cried. This young American who smelled like gun oil and coffee and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. The 101st got orders to move out. For real this time, not the false start that had nearly killed them all. They were pushing toward Arnhem, toward Germany itself, toward the battles that would end the war or kill them trying. Captain Davies gave the civilians a choice. They could stay in Vegel, wait for the village to be rebuilt, trust that the Germans wouldn't come back a third time, or they could evacuate further west, away from the fighting, toward areas already secured. Anna chose to stay. This was her home. These ruins were where she and Jan would rebuild when he came back, but before the Americans left, she made sure every soldier knew they were not forgotten.